This is AP Biology Unit 7, Natural Selection, and this video is video 4 of the 5-video series. This is going to cover a bunch of subunits: evidence of evolution, common ancestry, continuing evolution, and origin of life on Earth. So let's talk about what kind of evidence supports the theory of evolution. And as a reminder, a theory is something in science that is well supported with multiple lines of evidence. So how is this particular example evidence of evolution? How do homologous structures, like the bones in these mammals, provide evidence of evolution? Related organisms share derived characteristics that were present in the common ancestor. So in this case, the general bone structure in limbs of mammals is quite similar. So you can figure out what those derived characteristics are, what that common ancestor kind of looked like in terms of the bones of the limb, and then it's radiated from there in more specific lines within these species. Fossils are something that allows us to see those progressive changes, especially when we're talking about bone structure or exoskeleton structure. How can we determine the date of fossils? Fossil dates can be determined by multiple methods. One is by layering, so relative dating, so that as sediment is laid down, the newer layers cover up the older layers. So as you go back through layers of rock, the oldest ones are generally at the bottom. Once in a while they'll shift kind of to the side, but you can still figure out which ones were laid down first, and those are the oldest layers. Another method is radiometric dating. So all molecules, they're isotopes of all molecules. And over time, those radioactive isotopes change into more stable forms. And so you can measure how many of the molecules are in different forms of their isotopes, and from that calculate a year. You really don't need to understand the details of that, other than just understanding that isotopes allow us to figure out how old fossils are. Here is a figure that shows another method of sort of figuring out evolution that shows that evolution has been happening over time. What is the takeaway from this figure? This figure is comparing hemoglobin, so a protein molecule that is found in a lot of mammals. In fact, hemoglobin is a protein that is found not just in a lot of mammals, but similar molecules are present in virtually all kingdoms of life. And actually, there's some evidence that similar molecules to hemoglobin go all the way back to the last universal common ancestor. But a more general takeaway is that identifying how many differences exist in an amino acid sequence of a protein, that can be used as an indication of relatedness. And it shows that evolution happened over time, that change happened over generations. This also allows us to see that more closely related species show more similarities. So that between human and gorilla, there's only one amino acid difference in a hemoglobin chain, whereas a human versus a frog has many more differences. In addition to proteins, you can also use other molecules to track these evolutionary changes, including DNA and RNA itself. Finally, another piece of evidence of evolution is that we share common molecular and cellular structures and processes across not just closely related species, but all domains of life. So the process shown here is one of those examples of a highly conserved process that's seen in all domains of life. What is this process? This process is glycolysis, so it's the splitting of glucose into 2 pyruvate molecules. And that is a highly conserved process across many, many, many organisms. So now we're going to move on to 7.7, common ancestry. This is just a single slide. So in addition to molecular evidence of common ancestry, there are also structural pieces of evidence. So look at these 3 diagrams. These each represent a different piece of evidence showing that all eukaryotes show a common ancestor. The first one is showing membrane-bound organelles. Second one is showing linear chromosomes. In prokaryotes, chromosomes are circular, whereas in eukaryotes they're linear, and that's true across all eukaryotes. And the third is that genes can contain, that should say introns, genes contain introns. Moving on to 7.8, continuing evolution. All species have evolved and continue to evolve. There are so many examples here. Let's see if you can come up with an example of relatively recent evolution. A couple of examples you might have come up with, and it's fine if yours is something else. One example is loss of pelvic spine in some populations of stickleback fish, depending on the predatory pressure in those lakes. Also beak size of finches in the Galapagos. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria is evolution that can happen on a very short time frame. Also, lactase persistence in humans. There's a great HHMI video about lactase persistence in humans, and it talks all about the recent evolution, kind of the tie between DNA evolution and cultural evolution and how those go together. So now we come to the last section of this video, which is origin of life on Earth. You don't really need to know the details of this, but you should have a sort of overall basic idea of where life on Earth came from. So primitive Earth provided inorganic precursors from which organic material could have been synthesized. And this just happens naturally as different molecules are sort of bopping into each other. You can get the synthesis of more complicated molecules. Additionally, some molecules, such as ribose, can form in asteroids, and that is another idea of sort of building blocks where some of these more complex biomolecules, such as RNA, originated from. Just to give you a little idea of what time frame we're talking about, the Earth formed approximately 4.6 billion years ago, but it didn't support any life until approximately 3.9 billion years ago. But that's when we're talking about. Something important to understand in terms of origin of life on Earth is deep sea hydrothermal vents. We actually talked about this in a video long ago when we were talking about energy and the formation of cells. So deep sea hydrothermal vents provide conditions that have been experimentally shown to allow for the self-assembly of protocells, essentially very, very early cells. So those hydrothermal vents, the idea is that's probably where sort of cellular life began. Another piece of evidence of early life on Earth are stromatolites, and those are pictured in the upper right. This is the oldest fossil evidence of life, dating back to 3.5 billion years ago. These are layers of rock that were created by cyanobacteria fusing together sediment. And these cyanobacteria were really important for life on Earth because they produced oxygen and changed the Earth's atmosphere. All right, last up is RNA world. The RNA world hypothesis is that RNA predates DNA as the earliest genetic material. What evidence supports this? And these diagrams are all from a video. I believe it's a Stated Clearly video. So what are the three pieces of evidence shown here? One is that RNA is in all living cells, so it must be ancestrally very, very old. The second is that RNA has the ability to replicate and evolve on its own. And the third is RNA, a specific type of RNA named ribozymes can catalyze reactions like protein enzymes. So enzymes are proteins that catalyze reaction. Ribozymes are RNA that catalyze reactions. And ribozymes can form proteins and are a critical component of modern ribosomes. So RNA can kind of take care of all of these basic processes. They are in all living cells, they can replicate, they can evolve, and they can catalyze reactions, which is evidence that these have been around for a long, long time. So that's it for this video, covering a whole bunch of sections of Unit 7, and reminder, Unit 7 is natural selection.